Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's discussion, which is Water Stories, Past and Present, brought to you by the Melbourne Conversations, which is the City of Melbourne's program of free public talks. My name is Genevieve Grieves. I'm your MC/host for this evening. I'm a Wurundjeri woman from New South Wales, and I acknowledge my ancestors. I also acknowledge the country we are on, the lands of the Kulin Nation. I acknowledge the ancestors of this country, their descendants, and the strong Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community who call Melbourne home today. We are very lucky to have two senior Kulin elders here with us tonight, Auntie Joy and Uncle Larry. And I acknowledge both of you for all that you do for all of us, and personally as you both guided me in my path, so I wanted to acknowledge both of you. I also acknowledge all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here with us today. So a little bit about me. I work as a curator, artist, filmmaker and oral historian, and have been privileged to be based in Melbourne on and off since 2000. My latest role has been as the lead curator of the First Peoples exhibition at the Bunjilaka Aboriginal Cultural Centre, the Melbourne Museum, which many of the people on the panel have actually contributed to in various ways. And in fact, all our panel members have worked at the museum or with the museum at some point, which is another interesting story that we all have. The four speakers we have are amazing, and the first one is Auntie Joy Murphy Wandin. So Auntie Joy is a very hard person to encapsulate in a few sentences because she's a senior elder for the Wurundjeri people and for the Melbourne community, and she has many, many different roles. She's contributed in so many ways, not just to the Aboriginal community, but to the wider community in Melbourne in sharing her culture and history. She is an adjunct professor at Swinburne University, and she's a former trustee of the NGV. She's been awarded many awards, including the Victorian Aboriginal Women's Award and Maiden Officer of the Order of Australia. She's an ambassador for Breast Screen and Zoos Victoria. She's also a conceptual artist who has collaborated with Philip Glass and Mark Atkins for a performance here at the Town Hall, and also contributed greatly to the opening and the closing of the Commonwealth Games in 2006. But most importantly, she is an elder, a senior elder, who shares her knowledge and culture for all of us and to all of us to create a better society and greater understanding for all of us. So please welcome her to the stage.
Oh dear, these young ones, I tell you. Thanks, Genevieve. I'd like to begin this evening by, very sadly, we've had passing of a much-loved son in our family, our community family, and I just want to pay my respects to their family. They've just lost their much-loved father, and he was a brother to many, and some of you may know him, but he passed away just short of 12 months, and that, of course, was Reg Blow, or Uncle Reg Blow, and now, sadly, his son has been taken. I would also like to very much pay my respects to the First Peoples of this land here in Naarm, my people, my father's people, the Wurundjeri, and say to you how proud I am to have these moments in my life. As Genevieve said, I think she should have said I'm hard to find and hard to catch, because the ever-growing request, which is fantastic, just never know where you're going to end up, but nevertheless it is also very much a privilege and an honour to be given permission to welcome people to country. And I would also like to acknowledge all of our ancestors and elders and community that have gone before us, and of course those that are still with us, and in particular the panel members. I'm sure you'll get a laugh tonight. We're not all that serious. Well, we are serious about what we do, but we do manage to have a bit of humour left in us. So Tony, Gary, Larry, and of course you, Genevieve, as a beautiful young woman that we look up to, because you're one now that's helping to turn those pages even faster in our history, and ensuring that people do get a better picture of where we're at. So thank you. And I know I can see some faces in the community, brothers and sisters, and I acknowledge each and every one of your presences, and to each and every one of you that have come along tonight, thank you. Nodjkin. I've been out filming this afternoon for another video for Cricket Victoria this time, and it was just quite amazing because it just wasn't only me. It is about where you come from and your belonging, but equally there were three beautiful young people from Wurundjeri, and they played a very important role in that Welcome to Country video. So I feel like I've been so embraced today. You don't feel like that you're just the only one out there. And I say just the only one because sadly for me, I don't have anyone that I can talk to, that I can go home of a night and just kind of debrief for the day. And I've lost them all just in a few short years. So I kind of feel sometimes that I am out there alone, but I know there are lots of wonderful people in my community, and of course you and those people that I share stories with. But I guess where I'm coming from with this is that when I was speaking about Welcome to Country, they and the others that were there were saying, gosh, we didn't know that before. We never heard you say that before, And I said, well, that's good because, the brain must be still intact and I'm bringing out newer things. So it was really, really, it made me feel very happy to be able to say, well, I've told them something different. However, there is a traditional side to Welcome to Country, and they have been practiced for thousands and thousands of years. And each of our communities across this great continent, each of us have our own belonging, and by that belonging comes our custom of welcome. In traditional times, it was about establishing a relationship. There'd be a request from a neighbouring community, and the process was that each community would have a wirigiri, a messenger, a young man, a young warrior, who would have the responsibility to go to and from our community to the neighbouring community and relay messages. And at the end of that, to my knowledge, no one was refused. However, when permission was given, there were three main things that you had to abide by. One was that you entered country with permission, of course. Secondly, that you, when you came onto country, you must respect the law of the land. And thirdly was that you were only able to stay a short time. The short time was because, as you would know, I hope, that our people were not nomads. I don't like that word. They were seasoned travellers, and each place that they stopped at for a period of time, that cycle, was where they prepared, regenerated the land for their next visit. So that was the traditional message. Today, that still applies, but of course it could be in a very different way. However, all of the eucalypt of the bush, not just the managum, who the Wurundjeri are known as, but all the eucalypt of the bush was gathered to make seating for ceremonies and, of course, used in the fire ceremonies as well. I've picked these leaves this morning from my place, and it's an offering to you today as that symbol of custom of welcome, that I'll take a leaf on your behalf. And should you accept this offer, and I hope that you do, it means that you are welcome to everything from the tops of these beautiful trees to the roots of the earth. It also means you join with me to pay respects to my ancestors. I'm going to tell a little story, one of our two dreaming stories. And one, of course, the traditional one is about the artefacts that were used in establishing the river and the waterways. So what happened back in those thousands of years was our people would find grinding stones just laying around, and they were moulded into a shape over a long period of time. But they were also used for not only for very many other reasons, but particularly for I'll show you this one. For making the sharp edge of another stone. Endless hours, grinding, grinding, grinding. That's a bit sharper. Probably wouldn't cut anything today, but it probably wouldn't take all that long if we had the patience that our people had to make that a sharp, very sharp object where you could cut many things, bark from the tree, cut animal skin, anything that you required to cut. So I'm going to pass them around because I'd like you to have a feel of those and hopefully give, thank you, and hopefully give you a feel for what the traditional dreaming story is. And I have to read it because I can't remember every part of it these days. So it is called How the Yarra Was Formed by Billy Balleri of the Woiwurrung, or the Wurundjeri people. Once the water of the Yarra was locked in the mountains. This great expanse of water was called Murrul, or the Great Water. It was so large that the Woiwurrung had a little hunting ground. This was in contrast with the Watharongs and the Bunurrongs, whose hunting ground was the lovely flat, which is now Port Phillip. Mo Yarra, slow and fast running, was the headman of the Woiwurrung. He decided to free the country of the water. He therefore cut a channel through the hills in a southerly direction and reached Western Port. However, only a little water followed him, and the path cut for it gradually closed up, and the water again covered the land of the Woiwurrung. At a later time, the headman of the tribe was Barwul. He remembered Mo Yarra's attempt to free the land. He knew that Mo Yarra still lived on the swamps beside Western Port down near Kurirup. Each winter he saw the hilltops covered with the feather down, which Mo Yarra plucked from the water birds sheltering on the swamps. Barwul resolved to free the land. He cut a channel up the valley with his stone axe, but he was stopped by Mount Borbor, the mountain. He decided to go northwards, but was stopped by another mountain, Donabuang, and his brothers, all the other mountains. Then he went westwards and cut through the hills to Warrandyte. There he met Yan Yan, another Woiwurrung, who was busily engaged in cutting a channel for the Plenty River in order to drain Morang, the place where he lived. They joined forces, and the waters of the Murrul and the Morang became Murrulbark, the place where the wide waters were. They continued their work and reached the Heidelberg Templestowe Flats, or Warringal, Dingo Jumper, and there they rested while the waters formed another Murrul, another great lake. Barwul and Yan Yan again set to work, but this time they had to go much slower because the ground was much harder and they were using up too many stone axes. Between the Darebin and the Merry Creeks, they cut a narrow, twisting track looking for softer ground. At last, they reached Port Phillip. The waters of Murrul and Morang rushed out. The country of the Woiwurrung was freed from water, but Port Phillip Bay was inundated. So tradition has it that nothing was achieved in a short time, and I guess when we mention years and years of existence of First Peoples on this land, it's not just about them being on this land, it was the endeavours that they had to endure and thus created what we have today. How's the bell going? Should I finish? Oh, have I? All right, good. And I just wanted to finish on a little chirpy note. It's Christmas time and there's children and happy times and so forth. And I love this little story, albeit a little bit sad. But this is one for children, and it's about two little boys who played in the bush. And it's coincidentally that Tony's going to tell a story about two little boys, but it's not the same one. Is it? No. Okay. They had little toy spears and they were out trying to catch birds and so forth, and they weren't so lucky. And one of them spotted a wattle tree and said, "Oh, that gum up there looks pretty good." And of course the gum is the sap of the tree. So one of the boys said to the other one, "You climb up and you get the gum and throw it down to me." So he went up and of course started to throw down the gum. It landed, but it disappeared. And this went on, and the boy on the ground kept poking his spear around, and eventually he found this little hole. So he poked into the hole and he went, "Rah!" There's this old man's roar, because he jumped back in fright. But the boy up in the tree was so busy with the gum that he didn't see what happened down below. This old man comes out of the ground who'd been there for a long time, and he had huge feet. And the little boy was petrified, so he was just motionless, he couldn't move. So he picked him up under his arms, and the little boy, of course, was crying, and the old man went along with his big feet, and he was dragging, and of course caused a furrow, and the little boy's tears formed a creek and then a river. The little boy up the tree eventually saw his mate was missing, so he ran down and ran after him through the water. And then Bunjil came into the story, and Bunjil the eagle gathered these big stones and placed them in the front of the old man, and the old man fell over, and then the two little boys swam home. Thank you.
Very good timekeeping, Auntie Joy. Very impressed. Haven't had to ring the bell yet. Thank you for those beautiful stories. The next person I'm inviting up to the stage is Gary Presland, who is a prize-winning author and editor who specialises in local Aboriginal history and the natural history of Melbourne. Gary has worn many hats. He's been in the Navy, he's managed the Police Historical Unit at Victoria Police, he's worked in the Victorian Archaeological Survey and also at the museum, where he was once a senior curator. So his latest publication is the book First People, not to be mistaken with the exhibition First Peoples. A lot of people actually mistake them in our museum shop, which I think is good for Gary. His sales have increased. But it's a fabulous book about the Eastern Kulin, and lots of wonderful culture and history in that book, so highly recommend it. And he is currently researching our long-gone rich waterways that were at the time called swamps by European settlers. So please welcome Gary to the stage.
Wonderful. Now this is clearly a very early picture of the inner area of Melbourne, but I'd like to invite you to think of it as rather, or as well as that, an illustration of one of the reasons why this particular part of Melbourne, this area along the Yarra, was of particular importance to the Kulin world. And the reason that was so was because of the numerous wetlands in the frame here. I'll give them names: West Melbourne Swamp, Sandridge Lagoon, what we now call Albert Park Lake, and a billabong on the Yarra just there. Now these wetlands played a fundamental role in the Kulin world, in that they allowed the regular meetings of the language groups that made up the Kulin. The Kulin was a nation of 4 language groups. The constituent parts of the Kulin were, that is to say, the language groups were Boon Wurrung, Woi Wurrung, Tong Wurrung, and Watha Wurrung. These clans, the clans that made up these language groups, all claimed particular areas, and basically occupied the area of central Victoria from Bass Strait through to the Murray River, a very large block of central Victoria, but they were connected in a whole range of different ways. They were connected by thought and kin and tongue. Their languages were related, they intermarried, and they shared beliefs regarding the genesis of the world. Because of those connections, and in order to confirm and affirm those connections, there were regular meetings around the Kulin world, perhaps 2 or 3 times per year. One of the places where these meetings took place, involving hundreds of individuals, was on the Yarra River at about the same point that, or in the same general area, that from 1835 onwards, Europeans invaded the country. What's interesting about, one of the many things that's interesting about the situation that Europeans faced was that they came face to face with the people who had a completely different view of landscape. And for the Kulin, people of the Kulin nation, these areas that were very soon referred to as swamps by Europeans were in fact the mainstay of their meetings, because it is the wetlands of the areas. We call them wetlands now because we like them. If you don't like them, you call them swamps. The early European settlers did not like them. But for Aboriginal people, they were in fact the mainstay, as I say, of their way of life. And it was the occurrence, the presence of those large wetland areas that allowed greater than usual numbers of people to meet in the Melbourne area. And so Wathaurong people from the Bellarine Peninsula and further west, coming up from their estates, would camp at the end of the high country, the highland above the West Melbourne swamp, at the end of what is now Lonsdale Street. So in there, they would be close to the swamps. The people, the Tongarung people coming from the Goulburn River and the other side of the dividing range, would camp in the area we now refer to as Clifton Hill, from where they had ready access to swamps along the river. And Boonwurrung people coming up from Mornington Peninsula, Western Port and Wilson's Promontory would camp adjacent to the Billabong. They would be on the south side of, it's in there, sorry, that Billabong in there, which was an Anna branch or Billabong of the Yarra, was their preferred camping area for Boonwurrung people. The host group, if you like, the Woiwurrung people, camped on the other side. And they had access to plenty of wetlands as well. Most of these wetlands now are gone, so it's very difficult to picture exactly where people might have camped. The reason they camped close to these areas is that wetlands are the most productive of ecological zones within the Melbourne area, within anywhere. Where swamps occur, they have a high degree of productivity. So they provide the Indigenous people with a wide range of foodstuffs, plant foods, birds' eggs, and because these things were so productive, people could stay in the area for much longer. To give you some idea of the productivity of these things, the Billabong on the Yarra, for example, was one of the wetlands in the area noted for its bird life, and a survey of birds in the 1850s counted something in the order of 60 species of birds, that is ordinary water birds in the main, but also terrestrial birds. But of course, because the billabong adjacent to the Yarra was flushed regularly by the Yarra itself, it was fresh water and was also home to eels in season. Eels could be caught and were seen to be caught by young men. In one instance, 2 young men were able to catch 20 pounds of eels in a very short time by wading around in the water, holding the eels down with their feet and then spearing them. A very tricky operation, I would imagine. So these wetlands were, in fact, as I say, the mainstay that allowed large numbers of people within the Kulin Nation to be in the area for 2-3 weeks at a time, during which, of course, they enacted a whole range of different ceremonies. Corrubberies were commonly performed. Corrubberies were like a singing and dancing competition. They were started out as a welcome and a way of providing entertainment to the visiting language groups, but also a way of saying, look how clever we are, we have devised this song and dance routine. And then a couple of nights later there'd be another one by one of the visiting groups to try and outdo them with a different song and dance routine. So it was something like an Eisteddfod. And people, it was an occasion for the exchange of marriage partners and probably for the initiation of young boys and girls of the appropriate age. But it was also a time for people to catch up on what's been happening in other parts, and in some cases, because Woiwurrung people were connected to Taungurung people, families were seeing their daughters who'd gone off in marriage, maybe 1 or 2 years before. They would have seen them at regular intervals in that time, but they would be able to catch up and see what's been happening up at the other end of the Kulin world. So these were times that were fundamental to the continued existence of the Kulin world, and it all revolved, as I say, around the presence of the wetlands. But where Kulin people saw natural provision, Europeans saw things that were of no value at all. You couldn't farm a wetland, you couldn't build on it. And wetlands, in fact, in Western culture have had an interesting conceptual place, because they don't seem to fit easily into the natural classification of land or water. They're neither one nor the other fully. And so they tended to be ignored until the area was needed. Moreover, such was the very low regard with which Europeans held these areas, such as Sandridge Lagoon and the lagoon that ultimately became Melbourne Park Lake, that they were used for dumping rubbish and sewerage. And all of these lagoons, particularly West Melbourne Swamp, Sandridge Lagoon and the Albert Park Lagoon, were ultimately nothing more than festering rubbish tips. And so something ultimately had to be done about them. And this was also necessary because following the discovery of gold in 1850, Melbourne became a very large city, and then something needed to be done about the river and the lack of good docking facilities. So ultimately what happened was that the wetlands were, the word is reclaimed. West Melbourne Swamp, West Melbourne Swamp was eventually turned into the area where Docklands now is and completely drained. Sandridge Lagoon, for a time, most of it was filled in, but for a time it was a short little harbour for small boats. Nothing now exists of that except for a park a reserve called the Lagoon Reserve. Therein is the giveaway. And two little streets on either side which have a peculiarly parallel course, and they're called Esplanade East and Esplanade West. And the lagoon adjacent to the Yarra was incorporated into the initial design of the Botanic Gardens, and with the straightening of the river in 1900, it literally became a lake. And so that now still has some form, but basically unlike, and that's interesting in its own way, because in most cases the wetlands in the Melbourne area have been completely dried up and have vanished and exist now only in the memories of historians, I guess. Thank you.
I think we're going to have this problem all night. I didn't want that to end. That was so interesting. Thank you, Gary. And we got some new ideas for some social events that we can have. A bit of Aboriginal Idol, maybe. So that was very useful as well. But thank you, Gary. That was really fantastic. So I'm now going to introduce to the stage a Tangwarang elder, Uncle Larry Walsh, who has been an active member of the community for 40 plus years. We're trying to work out how many years tonight, but it's a long, long time. It's actually his birthday tomorrow as well, so we may sing happy birthday at some point. And he's still working out which year he was actually born in, because he's got 2 birth certificates, and he's that kind of a man, because he has an amazing history, which I've been privileged to hear parts of, and we have a little bit on our website, on the First Peoples website, if people want to read a bit more about him. He's an extraordinary storyteller who not only tells stories from the time of creation, he tells contemporary stories today, and he shares those stories with many, many people in wide forums. But he's an educator, absolutely, and I've been privileged to know him for a long time and to have worked with him on the First Peoples exhibition. He was one of our Yulunj members, our knowledge holders, who guided us and helped us to tell the stories that we did. But he's got a very rich history, which I can't summarise here at all, except to say, he's been a great mover and shaker in the rights movement. He's worked in many community organisations. He's worked in cultural heritage. He's an extraordinary person to have around and to know and to be mentored by. Please help me to welcome him to the stage.
Thank you, Genevieve, and thank you, Auntie Joy, for that welcome. It was well appreciated. I'm not going to tell stories too much about the stories I normally tell, but I'm going to tell you about me as a 14-year-old. See, I went to work in Melbourne at the meatworks, and all the meatworks were along the Maribyrnong River at that time. It was the late 60s, early 70s. In my day, you did go out to work at 14. Not like today, which, thank goodness, where we leave our kids at school and they get a better education than us, which shows more promise for their future. Now, back them days, I must admit, there was a lot of blood and chemicals going in the river. But if you went up the top end of the river, not down near all the factories, it was all open grass plains. When it flooded, it was full of birds, lots of insects too, the bit. But come spring, all the young fellas and young girls, that was where they used to go for the parties behind their parents' back. And unfortunately, I was one of them. I have to admit it. But before my time, I was hearing stories that they used to go on a boat up in the 40s and 50s, up the top of the Maribyrnong to where it turned into fresh water. And there was this park, Avondale Heights. And like me at 14, 15, 16 and whatever, people used to go there by boat because there was a dance there. People used to go and take their girl that they were trying to impress and take her up there for a dinner dance. That closed in the late 50s. So anyone born before there and their parents went up the Maribyrnong, you know where you were created. But for me, I've always called the Maribyrnong the most romantic river in Melbourne. No, not because of my escapades. But when you travel along the Maribyrnong and you get up high above the river on all the cliff faces that overhang it, on a beautiful clear night, with a full moon up and the mist rolling in, it is the most, to some people, the most spiritual view you could see. For others, it's one of the most romantic views you can see. And you can imagine, because it's so quiet along there at that time, because we are in autumn at that time, that the people that live there, the old people that lived there years before the settlements, they must have had, that belief in their creators and how the Creator gave them such a beautiful world. That view would have been confirming that for them. It would have made them go like, wow. And this is what Bunjil left us. That's what I love about the Maribyrnong. I don't love all the factories that are now turning into housing estates. I don't love the fact that I'm a bit afraid to swim in it because I know what chemicals went in there because I worked in the factories. But luckily, no, I have been part of the revegetation along there too. Myself and a couple of people who are no longer around, we decided that all our young Aboriginal kept talking to us about working outside. So we decided to form a project. And there was a new park. Isn't it funny? Labor gets rid of parks. Liberals actually build parks. Now it's reverse. But I'm not blaming anyone. It's just the way politics works. For me, this is why the story of the Cobra, the koala, is important. And I'll end with that story because it's about, some people think it's about sharing, but I also reckon it's about never trust anyone else with your resources. You've got to look after them yourself. Because if you live in someone else's hand, the resource could disappear. But for me, we built that park and that garden. It's called Pipe Makers Park. Oh, by the way, it's reserve signs. I'm not reading anything. I'm an ad-libber. I've never been good at... some people even think I can't read or write because I never try. But I do. But I just pretend I can't be bothered. Anyway, getting back to it. And it was the start of a wonderful association with Parks Victoria over the years, who decided the idea of re-vegging parks and re-vegging riverways was a good thing. And on and off I've worked with people at Parks Victoria, both in my area in Melbourne, worked with people who are rangers to ensure they get the knowledge that these lands and this waterway revegetation is important, not just to Aboriginal people, but to the future of Melbourne. See, water is not just the lifeblood of the land. At one stage, it was the superhighway. You know how we talk about the highways and the freeways where we take all the things in trucks? Well, there was no trucks when early settlers arrived. There was no trucks when we come to visit Melbourne in them days. We came via the waterways, canoes, after we got the welcome from the Wurundjeri to come. We come down via the riverways, by the creeks, by the waterways, so that there'd be food on the way when we came down. There'd be shelter on the way when we come down. And there'd be people there. And part of Auntie Joy talking to you about her welcome was also they'd give you a bit of water. And that reason was so that you knew not only the importance of the land, but the importance of looking after water too. And today, that's why I love when Auntie Joy does a full ceremony, when she gives out the water and everything, because it's reminding people of that. And these are some of the things that, not just reminding us, but trying to remind the memory of the rest of the people in Melbourne and in Australia, because it is about how important a good, healthy, clean waterway is to not just Aboriginal survival, to not just the survival of the birds and the plants, and to help create biodiversity, but the survival of Melbourne. For without water, well, we couldn't farm. Without water, we couldn't eat. Without water, I couldn't have a shower and everyone would stink. So water is that important to us. Waterways, rivers is most important thing we've got. But as I say, for me, getting up there, around time, sunsets, the moon's full, it's hitting the water, it's showing the beauty of the water, and then the mist rolls in. And if you happen to have someone with you, they get closer to you. So I'm going to stop talking about the romance of the Maribyrnong River, because you'll think I've been a little bit of a rogue in my young days. You know, what's that story? The old term used to be pantsman. I don't know what they call it these days. But in the old days, they used to call it pantsman. But I'm not... I thank goodness my wife isn't here or I'd be in trouble. But anyway, the whole thing I'm getting at is that even I used to show some of these young apprentices that, because sometimes we'd be back after work talking about what's going to be done the next day along the river. And they go, how come you like this place? And I drag them up to the top of the valley. And they go, yeah. I go, look. And you know, every now and then I see one of those, well, they're now, I suppose, 30 and 40s. But I used to see them when they were in their 20s. And some of those girls were taking the fellas they married there to have a look. And some of the boys were taking the girls they ended up with to have a look. So the Maribyrnong Valley, still to this day, helps bring a new generation of people into this world. And I think I'd better end on that note.
I didn't know we'd be hearing creation stories of the Maribyrnong River. I love it. But it's very fitting because Uncle Larry is, an elder of the western suburbs. He's very involved in that area, and also Collingwood, Fitzroy. As I said, he's a man of many stories. And, we started to record some of his stories as part of this project, the First Peoples project, and we spent a few hours filming him. And the cameraman said, I will come back anytime for free. He said, that man is incredible. I think you'll all agree. Thank you, Uncle Larry. The final person I'm inviting to the stage is another person that I consider a mentor in my life. I'm very lucky. Gary, you've got to work on this. We have to build a relationship. Because Tony Birch is an extraordinarily gifted writer. He's an Aboriginal man who's published, a number of books, one of which won the Miles Franklin Award. He teaches at the University of Melbourne. He taught me Aboriginal history many, many years ago. He gave me really good marks, so I'm grateful for that because I need them now. And he's a person who's very generous in all that he does. He's supported me as a young Aboriginal woman throughout my career, and he actually worked on the last exhibition in Bunjilaka and has guided me much in the development of the new one. So that's my personal introduction to Tony Birch. But he's going to share one of his stories tonight, and please welcome him to the stage.
I wouldn't normally correct Genevieve and say I was shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award. I didn't win it. The only reason I say that is that where's the cheque for $50,000? That's all. But you should have won it, exactly. Should have won it. Anna Funda probably doesn't think so, but I should have won it. Look, as a start for me, people have said many things, and I don't want to repeat what people have said, but to several people I do want to say thanks. And Jeff Taylor I reckon I should be on salary for the City of Melbourne, because I've done many of these events for Jeff, and I reckon I'm his standby man or coming off the bench if other people fall through, but I always deliver for him. And Jeff's commitment to Aboriginal people and to the City of Melbourne and stories has been remarkable. He works so hard, and he's a great friend of the Koori community. Of course, to Auntie Joy, and we know that she's called on repeatedly to do these things, and that people who value Joy value what she has to share with us. And we did a gig together last year at Tarawara at Healesville, and one of the things that struck me at that event is that people starting, thankfully, to recognise Joy as an intellectual, not someone here to do something of a presentation, but to impart intellectual and cultural knowledge, and that was evident at that event, and I think reciprocated with great generosity. And to Larry Walsh, I was a short pants man. Threatened to do something but never did. But Larry's very modest in some senses, and he's sort of a bit self-deprecating. I know Larry's story, and it's a very tough story, and to see him here and imparting his knowledge shows the integrity of character of the man. And finally, to Gary Presland, I've been influenced by Gary Presland's work for many, many years, and the direction my work is taking at present, I'm rereading Gary. And I think one of the things we need to understand with Gary Presland, he epitomises again the notion that there's nothing exclusively Aboriginal knowledge and non-Aboriginal knowledge. When you do it well and you collaborate together, you do in fact share knowledge, and I think that's been evident because of the respect he has for us, but also his fearsome intellect. So I didn't want to take up too much time, but I may not get these four people together. And to young Jen, we think we'll see her at the university shortly, and we're going to work harder than she's ever worked before. Now, my association with the Yarra is interesting, is that in all the books that I've published, I've been often fixated about writing stories about the Yarra. In my first collection of short stories, Shadowboxing, in 2006, I published a story called The Sea of Tranquility, and that was a story about two boys who found their excitement and love for the Yarra River was more important than the first moon landing in 1969 by Neil Armstrong. And that was based on a real-life event of me sitting at school at Richmond High School when the astronaut Neil Armstrong was coming down the ladder to land on the moon, and I kept looking out of the window and couldn't think of nothing more important in the world than to be on the river. So I told my teacher I had to go to the toilet, and I got on my bike and pissed off, and went down and rode along the river home, and I still don't know if Mr. Armstrong landed on the moon or if that's I missed it by that much. And then in my second collection, Father's Day, I published a story on the Yarra River again called The Chocolate Empire, again associated with a really important historical event in Melbourne, the Great 1971 Flood, February 1971, based on a true life story of us making an ill-considered decision as Form 3 boys and girls, Year 9 they call it now, of deciding to have our last swim of the summer on the Yarra River the same day that the Yarra decided to flood. And I was perched on top of a bridge called the Catwalk, about 55 feet above the Yarra, which is the rail bridge between Richmond and Hawthorn, and I saw this enormous black cloud coming over, and I said to mate, what's that? He goes, oh, it's nothing. And by the time we jumped off the bridge and landed in the water, the flood of biblical proportions was just about washing us away, and it was quite hilarious to see a group of boys and girls lose their school clothes to the Yarra and have to sneak over into Burnley Park in our underwear. And in my new book of stories, The Promise, which is coming out in May of next year, I also have a river story. This is another book of short stories called The Toe Cutters, which is based in part upon a unfortunate Melbourne gangster, Desi Costello, being shot dead and dumped in a hole outside my back gate in 1971. They're building the Eastern Freeway at the time, and like Gary was talking about earlier, had desecrated the river at that time and changed the course of the Yarra to put in this freeway. They knocked down all of our houses, and people, of course, know this is something we're battling today with the East-West link. Our house was taken for that freeway, but Mr. Costello's body was dumped outside our back gate. You may know recently that I don't speak ill of the dead, particularly one who's fearsome as Chopper Read, but Chopper Read said on the 60 Minutes interview recently, a highly paid interview, that he in fact had shot Desi Costello when he was 17 years of age. It's actually not true, but I'm glad that Chopper's family have been rewarded and looked after because of his demise. But as part of Mr. Costello's death, another Melbourne waterside worker, Alfred the Ferret Nelson, went missing about a week later, as did his white charger, this valiant charger. We used to swim above Dights Falls at the time, and about a week after that, we were jumping off our rope into our waterhole, and I landed on the roof of a car. I went home and got my brother's snorkel that he'd bought at Coles in Smith Street for about 69 cents. And I don't know why, but when I put it on and went down to see if the ferret was in the car, my snorkel and glasses become filled with this brown swampy water. It wasn't a wetland, it was a swamp. And we were certain that the ferret was in our waterhole. Well, you wanted the car out because we didn't want it poisoned, so we rang Russell Street Police Headquarters and said, I'm the man who killed Desi Costello and the ferret, and we have put the ferret's car at the bottom of Dights Falls. Can you come and get him? The police arrived 3 days later and pulled out a 1949 Ford Prefect. It wasn't the charger and it wasn't the ferret. His charger was eventually found. There's a wonderful photograph, if you go to Google, of course, of the ferret's charger being pulled out of the water down at one of the docks, and it looks like a shark. It reminds you literally of that shark in Jaws, and the charger is sort of hanging from a hook, but we don't know where the ferret is. He's still missing. So if anyone... Now, my most recent project, though, is a story called The Ghost River, which is in the latest Griffith Review, Once Upon a Time in Oz. The very serious aspect of this story is that it's also part of a novel that I expect will be published in 2016, also called Ghost River, and it's about this period of the river in the early 70s. It's based around the life of two boys who are very marginal, and if anyone knows my work, I only deal with marginal people. If you're ever doing well in life, you'll never find your way into one of my books. And they love the river, and they fall in love with these older men who are also marginalised. These men are drunks. And I don't mind dealing with men who are marginalised and who enjoy a drink. And part of this was based on an Aboriginal man, a Wurundjeri man, Derrimut, whose knowledge was abused by Europeans in the 19th century, and Derrimut became an Aboriginal man affected by alcohol, as many non-Aboriginal and Aboriginal people are. And a Collins Street businessman saw Derrimut sitting in the gutter one day outside his bank, and he said to him, "Poor man, what can I do for you?" wanting to give Derrimut a handout. And Derrimut waved his hand. He said, "All this was mine. There is nothing you can do for me." So even in that sense of being in a state of desperation, Derrimut would not be belittled by this man, and he wanted to make a claim of what was taken from Aboriginal people. The other thing that links with this, and Arnie Joy did talk about this, I've always been fascinated by that story of the formation of the Yarra, the original formation of the Yarra, the story that Arnie Joy told. People may remember that in 2007 there was a archaeological and exploratory dive done for the shipping channel that was to be deepened for the Yarra, to go down to 17 metres from 14 metres. As part of that, two divers went down at the original mouth of the Yarra River, which is at the heads, and they went down into a crevice which goes down to 103 metres. And they did a dive to 103 metres till they found that old original bed of the Yarra River. And why I love that story is it brings those traditional stories and science together. This is Aboriginal knowledge. It's not some sort of folklore that can be written off the way that Gellibrand did when he documented that same story. He talked about it as an Aboriginal myth. These are not myths. This is scientific knowledge, and I love the way those two elements were brought together. So in my story, Ghost River, and in the novel, part of what I'll be trying to do is how these men who are regarded, like Derrimut, as people of no value, and these two boys, or children of no value, come to love the river and come to tell a story about the river that really ascribes sacred business to it. I'm only going to read the end of the story now to finish. It's just a couple of pages. You, of course, can get this if you want to get it. It's online for free, though. My story, if you go to The Guardian, the Australian edition of the UK Guardian, you go to Culture, of course, and then you go to books. My story is on that site. It's called Ghost River. So this is just the end of that story. Moses is the old guy. In the end, Moses was left alone by his fire. He got lonely and sad and angry. He said we weren't to hang around the river any longer. How long you been sitting here by the fire, boys? A couple of years, I answered, as Sonny tried adding up on his fingers. You spent 2 years wasting your time with a bunch of no-good drunks. It's time for you to piss off and grow up. I'd never heard Moses sound so mean, and we didn't want to go anywhere. We were happy on the river. I like the fire, Sonny protested, and your stories, even the ones that aren't clear. You still tell them good. Moses huffed and puffed and took a swig of his bottle. Listening days is over. I'm telling the two of you to piss off. Anyhow, I'm going and I won't be back. There won't be any stories to listen to. Where are you going, I asked, not really believing what Moses was saying. We want you to be here with us. We want to be outlaws like you and Big Tiny and Cold Can. No outlaws, he laughed. You don't need to be like us. We're gone. I couldn't work out why he was laughing. I was angry with him and screaming. We came to this campfire every chance we get, don't we, Sonny? Sonny was holding his chin in his hands and had tears in his eyes. He tried to say something but couldn't talk. Moses struggled to his feet, shuffled through the dirt to where I was sitting in an old car seat. He waved at me to stand up. When I refused to move, he grabbed hold of me under the arms and hugged me tight against his bag of bones body. He stunk of grog and dirt and sweat, but I didn't care. I didn't want him to let go of me, not ever. He rocked me from side to side as he spoke. It's time for old Moses to go with the water, back with my people, before this river is killed off proper. What people? Sonny called out. You said you had no people but the river boys. He kept hold of me. Oh, I have them all right, from way back. The Doc and Cold Can too, even Tall Boy. He'll find his way back. With his palms resting on my chest, he pushed me away. But not you, not yet. You've got to leave the river, go away. It's time for you to grow. Come back when you are men. The river will need you then. I cannot remember exactly what I said to Moses after that, but I know I told him I hated him and that he was nothing but a crazy person on the grog. I couldn't sleep on account of what I'd said and headed for the river the next morning to tell him I was sorry, but Moses was nowhere to be seen. He wasn't at his campsite the next day or the following night after school. It was months before Sonny and me accepted that Moses was never coming back. On the first warm day of the summer, we went for a swim at one of our water holes and made our way across the golf course to Phoenix Bridge, our favourite jumping spot. I always liked to jump first, and the drop never frightened me until I leapt from the wooden pylon supporting the bridge. As I fell through the air, I'd suddenly be gripped by a crazy idea that I would never find the river and I would fall through the sky forever. But I did hit the water, but not like I always had. Soon as I went in and plunged beneath the surface, a shock of cold clawed at my lungs. I knew there was something wrong. I couldn't breathe, in or out. I was sinking into darkness and swallowing poison water. I was afraid and knew I didn't want to be with the river boys. I didn't want to be an outlaw. But I couldn't help myself. My body was stiff with cold. And then I heard him, Moses, clicking his tongue, stamping his foot and calling to the Ghost River, not to take me but to set me free. Sonny said he'd never seen anything like it. I'm looking down from the bridge for you, thinking you've done your last jump, and then fuck me, you bob up on the side of the bank like one of them wild cats Tomboy used to speak about. The water lifted you onto the bank. How crazy's that? I coughed up water all the way home. I felt sick the next morning and told Sonny I wouldn't be going for a swim. I was lying on the couch watching daytime television. What about tomorrow? I don't know. I'll see how I feel. That'll be 2 days in a row away from the river. We've never done that before. And it's holidays. We haven't done this. So when are we going to go to the river again? Like Moses said, when it's our time. Thank you.
Can everyone please join me in giving them all a big round of applause? That was amazing. I'm going to invite everyone up onto the stage now. Grab a spot. So we're going to start talking through some of the themes, and we're going to invite you to get involved as well. I've learnt a huge amount tonight, as I'm sure you all have. We don't often get opportunities to hear stories as rich as these that stretch back from the time of creation to today, and are so funny as well. One thing I noticed about all the stories in different ways is they all talked about alterations to the environment. You know, even your story, Anna Joy, going back to the time of creation, the actual creation of rivers with axes and movement of water, and Uncle Larry with the factories, and everyone mentioned that. I guess, you know, is there something we can sort of learn from these stories of deep history and of more contemporary history that can help us to understand how to manage water today?
One of the things that's common is that Larry talked about being the apprentice around the western suburbs and that part of the river being, you know, pretty filthy, as the Yarra was. And when Gary talking about, you know, the way that wetlands are then referred to and denigrated as swamp, one of the things that I'm interested in is that spending all my teenage years on the Yarra, so I lived in Richmond and Collingwood for that whole, I think the most formative years from 10 to 20, when you're a short pants man. And what I would say that is important, all the kids that I grew up with along the river, we all lived in the commission flats, or we'd come off the commission flats. You know, kids from all different backgrounds. You know, there's about 3 or 4 Koori kids, but lots of kids. Kids from, you know, from the industrial north of England, coming from Manchester and stuff. And none of us had the language to articulate what you might call an environmental language, but that love of the river is intrinsic in people. And I think people often think that you need to understand these places in an intellectual way. So, yeah, you can intellectualise it, or you can talk about it what we might call a sophisticated way. And I think, although I can write, I hope, in that reasonably sophisticated way, what I try and do when I write about the river is in a way that we love that environment. And, yeah, while we swam and it was poisoned or whatever, we revered the river and still do. So when those same people in their 50s sit around talking about the river, it's with incredible love. And when you see it being damaged the way it is, it's shocking.
Well, for me, it was always the coast. You know, I grew up by the beach. It wasn't the river, but it was growing up by the beach. Or we used to travel around New South Wales and end up at little creeks where you could drink the water. You know, I remember as a kid always drinking water, and it's not something you could do today. You know, those shifts have happened very quickly.
They have. I think just picking up on that, you know, it's important for everyone to realise, you know, the conditions at those times when there are only Aboriginal people on country and how they survive. Not so much, you know, the way in which they survive, but how they survive. And just picking up on Gary's point about eels, you know, that the eels were so plentiful in the waterways. And, you know, I certainly remember that because, you know, my mum and dad used to take us fishing and, you know, we'd have to come home and, but we fished. We didn't actually stand in the water and, you know, I could barely touch them, I have to say, because I was so nervous of the skin and, you know, the slippery thing, but got used to it. But, you know, the thing for me is that what I mostly do now is in teaching Woiwurrung language to year 7, 8 and 9 kids, and in fact any schools that I go to or any community groups, I talk about the seasons of this country, and like eels, that's in March, you know, eels come down, the short-finned eels come down to join the female eels down here at where the salt water meets, the fresh water meets the salt water, just there at William Street. And one day we were down there filming, and my brother, a younger brother, had never been to the spot. We were just standing on the little ramp there, and he went, "Oh my God, look!" And here's this eel circling. And I said, "You wouldn't see that normally," but it was his spirit. I said to him, "That's your spirit, the presence of you being here," and that also gave him a very fulfilling meaning. So, you know, like at this time of year, we're in the very dry grass season. It makes sense. And all of these sensible things that happen for the survival of Aboriginal people are not widely known. So I'd encourage you to go along to the Museum of Victoria Koori Heritage Trust anywhere online, Herring Island. There, you know, you'll find out lots of information about the seasons. I just wanted to make a point about, you know, Gary is an historian. I greatly value all of Gary's work, and it's given me and my children and grandchildren a deeper understanding myself of not being there at the time of settlement, but to understand, and that map, just looking at that map is so mesmerising to realise, seeing it, you know, that it was there. So today if we go down to the Birrarung, there are no birds. There are just no birds. And again, I was being filmed for something, and, you know, they just said to me, "Where's the birds?" And I said, "Well, look what we've done to this country. We've taken every living species from this land, and how are we going to fix it?" I was saying to Gary, actually, it's not going to be in our lifetime, but for all of us, we need to make sure that we do have a serious attempt at trying to return country to like it was.
Yeah, but also I agree, because it is about love of land, love of water. But I think it's also that Melbourne is not taught its own history, the Melbourne that exists now. Why did those swamps were there? There was waterfalls, there was all these things that helped create the conditions that the early Europeans got rid of.
But we're still continuing to do it, Larry.
Yeah, they're still continuing to make those mistakes.
Yeah.
But I believe if we can teach the young and the not so young love of what can be there. I'm not saying it can go back to what it was, because I'm not going to be alive 300-400 years to see that. But I go and talk with kids and talk to them about cleaning up waterways, and I sometimes show them some of the plant's use, but I try and impart on them that what you do now, enjoy. So you're all teaching, and this is what I hate about teaching, they teach them how to pull the weeds out, but I teach them how to pull the weeds out and use them. You know, most of those weeds that are clogging up our rivers and waterways are European plants that were of use. So it's forgotten knowledge that Europeans must bring back, because if we teach kids, pull up plant and we'll clean it, why am I doing all this work and not going to see nothing? You know, go along the waterway and pull out a couple of those weeds that don't belong and show them how they can make something out of it, turn it into art, turn it into something they can take home, and they go back along the waterway and pull that weed out again because they do something with it. It's our teaching method of saying, if we do that, that'll do it. It's giving kids imagination to say, you can do this while you're doing that. And that's part of changing our thinking and the kids' thinking on what can be done, I think. Because every answer is part of the one. Like, we teach them about the plants, good. We teach them about how we seen that waterway and why we love it. that's part of it. But teach them to enjoy it instead of going, okay kids, you're all going to go weed this river and plant 1,000 plants, and at the end of the day they're all going, oh, I'm tired and I didn't do much. You've got to make it fun for them so that they'll come back.
I think too that we need to find a way of showing people that clearly water is a fundamental requirement for all life. It's fundamental in just about every aspect of our lives, but the way in which we relate to water, the way in which we relate to the watery features of the landscape is culturally embedded. Now, and what the basic problem I think for the Western world, for our culture, when I mean the Western culture, is that there is a disconnect between people and country. This is something which never happened for the Indigenous people of this country, so that it's clear from the different appreciations that people had of the wetlands, the swamps in the Melbourne area. If you compare the attitudes of the Indigenous population to the immigrant settlers. Now, all they were doing really was expressing the cultural values that they had. What we need to do now in order to, and I don't think that it will be a particularly easy thing, but we need to change as a Western culture, we need to change our view of the water, and that 100 years ago we would still have had the same appreciation that, say, the early European settlers had here. Our appreciation today of wetlands is based on an understanding of the importance of those features in the landscape, in ecological terms. But ecology is a very recent study, really only beginning in the 1930s. Yeah. Now we understand that our forefathers and mothers were wrong to reclaim and drain those swamps, and so we start putting them back. The problem is, because we all want to live near water, we put fake wetlands into areas where there never were wetlands. And so we get situations like Taylor's Lakes, Caroline Springs.
I used to live at Taylor's Lakes. There was no lake at Taylor's Lakes.
Well, that's right. These didn't have natural wetlands, and so what we're doing is, in an attempt to make ourselves or the residents of these places feel good, is we're putting in fake wetlands, which is a recipe for disaster.
I know you want to take a question from the audience, but there is a shocking, strange repetition taking place. So, because I'm hopefully writing this novel, I go to the river at least once a week, and I am going to swim in the river again this summer. So my wife has asked me to do my will, but I run from Princess Bridge to my mum's house once a week, which is basically from Princess Bridge to Collingwood. And what I've noticed is that when I was a kid, we lived behind the Collingwood football ground, and all those textile mills had been closed down, and you had this massive red wall behind the old Collingwood football ground. All the factory was shut down. There were no bike paths. There was no freeway, so the Alexander Parade used to just come to an end. And the river was cut off. Now, it was cut off, therefore it gave particular groups freedom, like teenagers. One of the things I've noticed a terrible change now, although there are the bike paths and what we call beautification schemes, etc., the massive development that's been taking place, say, around where IKEA is in Burnley, is these massive multi-storey developments. It's cutting the river off again. Not literally, you can get on the bike path, but when Gary talks about what we covered, it's again commodifying what you might call a river view, but it's the worst. And it's anti-democratic, and it's cutting off vistas, it's cutting off or limiting access. So it's strangely gone from a river of neglect that you couldn't get to, and now a river that you can get it if you can afford it. And I think both of those are the same problem, because if you want to talk about cultural mindsets, you make a river available to as many people as possible in a very open way. Now, parts of the river have done that, but this shift in the last 10 years is I think, quite a regressive way of thinking about the river.
Yeah.
Yeah, we might open it up to some questions. Has anyone got a burning question they want to ask? Yep.
Thanks for your stories. They were really informative. Something I'd like to add is the loss of industrial history along the river. I acknowledge the environmental loss, but what troubles me is those developments you were talking about, and we haven't got any shipbuilding anymore along the river, or we can't see any of the ships from far around the world that used to visit, and it seems to be a bit of a sterile environment that we're creating to encourage everyone to go down and live by the river, and just put in endless coffee shops and cafes. So what do you think about the loss of the working part of the river, where apprentices were employed and people toiled and interesting things happened?
Well, because I did work along the riverways, I have a fondness for that. But I actually think, unfortunately for us, we're never going to get the industries back. I think when you look, we as a city, a whatever, it's our planning. We don't think about the future more than 2 or 3 years, thanks to politics. And that doesn't allow us to look at how our future generations are going to work, what jobs they're going to do. I actually think one of the things that everybody talks about in the green movements is ecotourism. Ecotourism is not going to work in Melbourne. It's going to work to a little, not going to occupy 1,000 people's jobs. But I actually think we can, and we've got to change the way we think about work. I would love to see a lot more Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal kids out there working like I was. Feeling that's a quid I earned in my pocket, feeling good about it rather than having to live on welfare benefits. I want them to be able to have that same sense of pride I had as a young man and still have today, earning my own living. But I know the situation has changed and I accept that. I wouldn't mind if we did have people building some of those old rowboats and some of those old skips and punts for giving kids a chance to go up and down the river and maybe learn those skills, because a lot of those skills, you build a punt, you can build a house. It's the skills that you use to make some of those things that can be applied to, whether it be cabinet making, whether it be building house, whether it be whatever. But there's only so much of it that we can do to support the kids. It is what Tony was talking about, like the Maribyrnong River, once, even with the factories gone, the parts I talk about when I was 14 to 18 was all open grass plains, not one house, not one flat. I call them flats, they call them townhouses. It was a beautiful spot, and it's been destroyed for me because I see these developments and my memories of what was there, I can't show anyone, because if I point to it, I'm pointing to a townhouse. It's having some control of the development that happens along the rivers that we need to discuss. Then we need to discuss how we can improve the river so that it can create... and the funny thing is, I think it can create more jobs along those riverways by us improving the river, not doing development, because there are so many plants along the waterway that could be useful, could be of benefit to, well, my favourite plant is a kumbungi. You know that one, eh, Joy? You can use the leaves to make large mats or baskets. You can use the roots as food, but you get string out of it so you can make fish baskets or net baskets or whatever you want. And yet, the beauty of it, they clean the waterway. And so there's got to be some small industries that can be developed by both helping fix up the waterway and being able to use some plants that help us clean the waterways, that gives some people a bit of work, whether it be hobby work, whether it be, say, naturally made products, which seem to sell more these days than they did in the past. Plastic products were a big hit. Natural's coming back, natural fibres. And it's a way of encouraging people. I don't know in the other way.
The other important point that you make, though, is you'd be better off with a working river than an ornamental river. And yeah, the places that I've written about and writing about, they were massive factory complexes. And we know back from the 19th century that some of those factory complexes contributed to the degradation of the river, but there are actually many industries that didn't. And if you look at the destruction of the ports, and I have many relatives who worked on the docks, is that the way that ships come in and out of the bay hasn't changed. Those docks didn't, in fact, contribute in a negligible way to the river any more than they might now, and those old docks have been done away with again for these sort of glass and concrete and steel developments. I agree with you very strongly that one is that we've forgotten that history, so we have forgotten a lot of that industrial history and it's been obliterated. But I think the important point you also make, if we were going to have, or if we think about a relationship to a river, a working river is a river that people appreciate through their work. So again, people that I grew up around who worked in industries along the river, it might be that they only went out the back of the factory at lunchtime and sat on the bank, or they put a fishing line in after work. They came to have an engagement with the river. When you have a river that's just ornamental and beautified, I don't think it gives you a proper appreciation of what water is, and working with the environment I think is a much more fundamental way to have that cultural engagement that Gary's talking about.
Can I say that as a person who ran away to sea at the age of 16, I can say firstly that industrial history has not been forgotten by the likes of myself, and secondly that the reasons that, firstly I guess for that reason I find it deplorable that a country that is basically an island does not have more maritime resources than it does. But what we are dealing with, I think, in the movement of people away from the river in terms of industrial use are issues that are far larger than can be addressed simply by looking at the river itself. The size of the ships, and this has always been the case with Melbourne. It was vastly altered in its shape and direction from the 1870s up right through to 1900 for the simple reason of providing a decent workable port and cutting away the snags and bends in the river that made shipping, the movement of ships on the river, difficult. But ships, that once done, solved the problem in the short term. But ships continued to increase in size. The technology of shipping has changed enormously. Now, we will not have a return of ships back into the river. It simply cannot happen. I agree with what Larry says about the better appreciation of the river by focusing on the elements that are natural to the river and building up those elements in perhaps, and I think Tony was saying much the same, that we need to engage with the river in a light industrial way. Certainly we cannot go back to, and it makes no economic sense, if you like, to go back to large shipping in the river. It simply, I'm sorry to say, won't happen.
Thank you.
Could I just make a quick comment? I agree with everything that has been said in whatever context, but I just think my point is about the unemployment rate. It's at a really disappointing level, and no matter where you go. But for me, it's about vision. It's about, a vision of a council and that planning for that vision. And, to set up all these cafes and what have you along the riverside takes away that vision for not only what today was, definitely what yesterday was, and the future for this country. So for me, it's about a kind of polarised thinking that needs to occur in local government.
Your question has been very well answered. Talk about the Brains Trust here. Got another question here, thanks.
Thank you. I'm interested if there are community stories that are known about early cooperation between the Kulin and white fishermen, because it seems to me that each spot that you can see of Aboriginal significance, Sandridge generated a fleet, Mordialloc with its wetlands generated the fleet, Carrum and Frankston generated a fleet, and Morris Bay generated, the middens are there, and then the whites did the same thing. So are there community stories about sharing of knowledge, cooperation, or was it a coercion thing like the whaling? What's said in the stories?
Well, certainly there was a degree of coercion, I think, for existence. But and sharing of stories, otherwise you're not aware of each other's knowledge. But, my pain, I guess, is that Aboriginal people were not listened to as they should have been, and then we would not be facing what we're facing today. That's a short and simple answer.
There are two things. One that comes to mind, which is it might be a negative, but one's a positive. But it's a terrible lesson that Joseph Tice Gellibrand learned. Now, he had been the Attorney General or Surveyor General in Van Diemen's Land, and he drew up the bogus treaty documents that John Batman attempted to negotiate. Now, what happened with Gellibrand, he came across Bass Strait on his own and landed somewhere on Western Port, probably near Coronella, where Coronella is today. And if you read his diaries are really interesting for, I would call, a revelation of knowledge. So there is the coercion sort of works in reverse, or what becomes cooperation is out of desperation. So as he starts to walk across Western Port and then basically walks along the bay to heading to the mouth of the Yarra. He comes in January in 1836, so if anyone spends a summer in Melbourne in January, it can be pretty warm. It's very hot, quickly runs out of water, has no food. What he does is he picks up a Bonarong walking track, and that leads him to a water well. They find water. He sees smoke in the distance, he follows the smoke of the fire, again finds another water source. And what you see in the diary entries is a sort of what starts of a sort of an ignorance or a lack of recognition. He starts to know that if he does not avail himself of that Aboriginal knowledge, which is literally imprinted in the landscape like a text, he won't survive. So by the time he gets to the mouth of the river, his whole attitude to Aboriginal culture has changed, to the point where when he gets to the mouth of the river, like any Englishman with a sunburn, he sits down, his feet are blistered, he's just completely sunburned, he's dehydrated. Two Wurundjeri men come and pick him up in a canoe and bring him up to the settlement. An incredible act of generosity. And then he writes in his diaries of what he calls the dignity of Aboriginal people, the strength of carriage, in other words, athletic and fit, the knowledge of land, what he calls the modesty of Aboriginal women, which it might sound a bit patronising now, but it's important when you think of the way that Aboriginal women are being denigrated often in sort of description. So what I love about that story is that here was a man forced, because of his circumstances, to either avail himself to Aboriginal knowledge or die. He availed himself to that knowledge, he survives, and he recognises that. And more sort of going back to the point here, about industrial history, I tell you what, there's a great history of sailing and in sense of merchant sailing and goods from the Port of Melbourne all the way across Bass Strait to both Flinders and King Island, all around sort of, Launceston, Hobart. And what you get in those is Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal sailors, men and women, because they're going to the islands working in the same industries. So that in my family, my forebears, two of my forebears are a West Indian sailor, Prince Moody, an Aboriginal woman who marry because they happen to work in the same industry. And I think you would find that, and a lot of that sort of stuff's unrecorded, but I'm sure there are many instances of it.
Yeah, and there is a story of John Batman's settlement. And John Batman went back to get supplies because they were running out of supplies. And if it hadn't have been for the local Wurundjeri people, that first settlement may have ended there and then. Very quickly. Today, you have some of the plants bearing English names because they were the substitutes that were used by the Wurundjeri being generous, and yet it's not recorded properly. The whole first settlement, without the Wurundjeri people, would have perished, and we may not have had another Melbourne settlement for another 20, 30 years. In some ways, it's a blessing for yous. In other ways, it actually was if I want to look at it negatively, it was a bad thing for us. But the fact that these things aren't acknowledged and talked about more and or written about more is where the shame is. And even when Tony, you mentioned Derrimut, they had a headstone saying thanks to Derrimut that the early settlers put up, acknowledging Derrimut's role in saving the settlement. But they didn't acknowledge, for some reason, for a 6-month period, the Wurundjeri kept that settlement alive. And that seems to have been forgotten somewhere. I think we had the interaction, and it needs to be revived, it needs to be rediscussed, and it needs to be raised, because I think it's important that you're acknowledging the founding fathers, which is the celebration of Melbourne's founding every birthday, and 200 years must be coming up, another 20 years or something. But it would be a good thing to start bringing those stories up and that history up, so that both the Aboriginal people of Melbourne and the rest of Melbourne can walk together, and they would open the door for more people to start to learn about the environment that was there. Because if we're keeping hidden how Melbourne was formed and how Melbourne was raised and how Melbourne was saved, it's a hidden history that keeps us divided, and it stops you from saying, oh, you mean all those native plants were useful and they kept us alive. Where do native plants be? Swamps and waterways. That's why it's important to raise that back to that level of discussion.
Did you have anything to add, Donna Joy?
No.
No, well, I'm afraid we've run out of time. No more questions, too much to talk about. I've learnt so much tonight, and I just want to thank you all for coming and sharing in these stories, and thank all the panellists for their amazing contributions.